When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are black beyond measure.
Hit me. Listen to me now. Is you with me now? The biggie bounce. I know you dig the way I switch my style. Holla, holla. freak on, get your freak on, get your freak on, get your freak on, get your freak on.
Welcome back to the Black Table, an hour devoted to exploring ideas and subjects of special importance to people of African descent and others fighting to create a better society. I'm your host, Greg Carr, here on the Black Star Network, and today we are, as always, honored to have our guests, and it's a particularly important conversation we're going to have today, in fact. So we know the United States Supreme Court, for those of you outside of the U.S. watching this, has repeatedly upheld what is known as affirmative action in college admissions. The latest time they did that was 2016. You remember the Fisher 2 case. In fact, Antonin Scalia participated in those oral arguments and then transitioned to ancestorhood. At the time, that's when I found out from Justice Scalia that I went to one of those slow track HBCUs. But that contempt is mutual, a story for another day. We now know that the Supreme Court has the numbers basically to end affirmative action. And we know that the cases before the Supreme Court, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, and the North Carolina cases are going to take directly on whether or not race can be used as a criteria for admissions in higher education. Of course, these challenges being funded by Ed Bloom, our old friend from the Fisher line in Texas and so forth. But today, we are very fortunate to have with us a scholar who has devoted her academic career to really exploring issues at the intersection of race, class, culture, and we need this type of serious intellectual work in this moment. So we're being joined today by Professor Natasha Warikoo, who is a professor at Tufts University. Prof, it's great to have you here.
So great to be here. It's an honor. Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, Professor Warikoo has a long and distinguished resume. She's, and I'm just going to lead with the stuff that impresses the folks. Of course, you graduated from Harvard, what, 4 times, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. No, 3 times. That's right. And then, of course, your undergraduate degree, mathematician. Fascinating, huh? Brown University. Watched one of your discussions at Brown recently, and I'm like, wow, this is remarkable. Of course, has won all kind of awards, several books that she has published. The Diversity Bargain, some folks are probably most familiar with. She did a 2011 book, a comparative study of education in the UK and the United States, particularly at elite institutions. I think Oxford was the one in the UK. We're going to discuss your most recent book, probably take most time today discussing that. And I'll tell you, Prof, a few weeks ago, I was actually in New York on other business, and I stopped by Book Culture. And it was right during Columbia graduation week. So I'm standing in there and I picked up Race at the Top. Now, of course, whoever designed the book, brilliant, because immediately I'm like, oh, Race at the Top, because normally, as we know, would be Race to the Top. I'm like, Race at the Top. And so I started I was standing there reading it, and the kids are coming in their caps and gowns, and I was laughing out loud. I'm like, wow. And I realized, oh, this is the sister who wrote the diversity joint. And so I immediately bought the book on the way back. I read about half of it before I got back to DC. And I said, we have to talk to Natasha Warikoo. This book is so important, Prof. And before we get to it and your broader work, we have to ask you a kind of broad question. How does a Western Pennsylvanian end up in the academy in the way that you do? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your life journey today.
Yeah, well, once again, thanks for picking up the book, and I'm flattered that you found it some interesting ththings to think about. So, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, an old steel town called Johnstown, and my parents were doctors. They're from India, which is what brought them there. And I think, growing up, I think I benefited from, my parents being highly educated, and, although we were outsiders and very much felt like an outsider, they also provided a lot of resources and had the kind of cultural know-how to help us do well in school. And so, did well in school and went off to Brown University and kind of, struggled to find my way and figure, I loved it there, but figure out like what I want to do. And I remember at the end of my sophomore year, it was like, okay, time to decide your major. And I wrote down all the classes I took. I remember I had 3 columns, the classes, on a scale of 1 to 10 or whatever it was, of like how much I liked the class and then what grade I got in the class. And based on that, I was like, okay, I think I'll be a math major. I liked solving problems. I had a very analytic mind, and I was like, I'm good at this. I like it. It's fun. And then towards my senior year, I realized I had taken all these philosophy classes because I just found the subject interesting. And my friend was like, you've taken all these classes, you could get a major. So anyway, that was my second major, was philosophy. And then,
before we move on, let me just ask a question, because the way we understand it, I think Brown is the Ivy, you can do that kind of thing.
Yes.
And so, and of course, this is going to be particularly germane when we get to race at the top. That flexibility you felt as a young person, was that something that was engendered in the household? I mean, like I said, I was tongue firmly in cheek when I say Western Pennsylvania, because of course we know that at the heart of your work is this notion of immigration and the intersections. Was that something that was engendered in the household, or was that something you began to explore as a late teen there in Rhode Island?
No, I think it was really the culture at the university. I think my parents were much more like, all right, you're going to be a doctor or you're going to be an engineer, right? Like, those are the 2 paths.
All the Nigerians watching this, just you understand that you have, all right, okay, go ahead.
You got a choice, and then I was like good at math, so I was supposed to go the science route. But I didn't. So it was a big deal that I did it. I'll just say that. I also had a summer job. I just found a summer job teaching middle school kids. This program is now called Breakthrough. And I loved it. I just fell in love with teaching. And so I decided, after college, I was like, what am I going to do? I decided to be a high school math teacher. I started in middle school, a teacher of math. And I taught for 4 years in New York City. And the last school that I taught at was a school for recently arrived immigrants. And I started to realize that so much of what was going on in my students' lives was not about like, were they reusing this math curriculum or that math curriculum or my pedagogical choices? It was about the relationship between the classroom and the broader society, right? Were they food insecure? Did they have, what was their commute to school? Did they have legal status? Did they, what was the policy around like bilingual education? So all of these other things. So I wanted to kind of understand that a little bit better and study that. And I never took a sociology class as an undergraduate, but I sort of looked around and I realized that people studying immigration education were mostly in sociology departments. So I was like, all right, I should go to grad school in sociology if I want to study these things. I don't know how I got in, but
you're a natural social scientist. You're a natural social scientist. No, really, because I mean, even as you're describing this, I'm thinking about how you write in Race at the Top about this concept of cultural repertoire and the folks who engage as cultural brokers. And so it seems like you really organically really were grounded in that before you ever stepped foot in a graduate program. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I mean, it's just, you can really see it in the practice. The practice is what's driving your work. But anyway, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I think about that young woman all the time on Brown campus who had never heard of sociology, but I think I really did think like a sociologist. But I was never exposed. And as I think now about undergraduates, I'm like, how do I get more undergrads to like take sociology and understand, like use the tools to really make sense of the world? So I think, So
he was like, oh, wait, you like listening to people and trying to figure, oh, I could do that. Okay, well then come with me.
Yeah. I think people think of psychology, right? And psychology is an important field, but it's not just the internal world. It's like, all of the policies around us that shape our lived experiences. They, sometimes they have an intuitive sense, but they don't have a vocabulary to kind of name it, which I think is so powerful from sociology. So that's how I kind of got into sociology. My dissertation study, which became my first book, was about children of immigrants in New York City schools and in London schools and kind of youth culture and achievement. And then I started really thinking about like, what I really care about is educational equity. Like that's my, bottom line. But I started to, this was like around, Occupy Wall Street, and started really thinking about how we often especially at that time, only talk about inequality in terms of disadvantage. But of course, without advantage, there's no disadvantage. And, you know, we know that growing inequality is partly about the kind of top 1%, 10% kind of pulling away from everyone else, right? So how do we make sense of advantage? And so that's kind of what led me to study these elite undergraduates on these elite college campuses at Harvard, Brown, and Oxford, and how they make sense of, you know, educational opportunity, college admissions, affirmative action, and how do they justify their own position given all the advantages that they've had.
And diversity bar. So that was the diversity bargain, right?
Yeah.
Which won all kind of awards, y'all. By the way, the American Sociological Association, so many other awards that you won for that book. And you like to say your second book. I mean, the first one, and I didn't mention the title, Balancing Acts. And encourage you folk to get this work and to read that compared to people. It was fascinating how you kind of begun to tease out the fact that in the UK, where I think what you said was 14% non-white, Black, and Asian, I guess, including South Asian, there you don't see folk like that in the upper echelons of politics, and they were looking across the pond at the United States like, well, where's the pool? Oh, because they didn't understand the unique kind of configuration of the U.S. I thought it was fascinating in Balancing Acts in particular. I mean, diversity bargain, I meant to say.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a clear testament to affirmative action in the United States, like a pipeline towards leadership. So I was living in the UK when President Obama was elected, and you know, the question was, well, where's our Barack Obama? You know, and it was like, look at your elite college campuses. Like, you're not creating that pathway or those opportunities. There are ambitious, brilliant young people of all races in any country, at all backgrounds. But if you don't create those opportunities, then they're not going to be able to, you know, reach their fullest potential. And so
we're gonna take a pause, and we come back. Please don't lose that thought, Natasha, because when we come back, we want you to continue. And yes, some of those young people are responsible for Rhodes Must Fall, and he must fall. So at any rate, so we know that worldwide. Sorry, Rhodes scholars. At any rate, when we come back in a moment, we're going to continue with Professor Natasha Warikoo, who, of course, her most recent book is Race at the Top: Pursuit of the American Dream in Suburban Schools. And when we come back, we'll continue with her intellectual journey and how this has impacted her work. Back at the Black Table in a moment.
When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Does it get better than never getting lost? Does it get better than not parallel parking yourself?
Alexa, ask Smart Feed to feed the dog.
Does it get better than feeding your dog from 50 miles away? Yes, it does. At Buick, we see a future that's even better. Because the life-enhancing innovations you've never even dreamed of, Buick is dreaming of them every day.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jackie Hood Martin, and I have a question for you. Ever feel as if your life is teetering and the weight and pressure of the world is consistently on your shoulders? Well, let me tell you, living a balanced life isn't easy. Join me each Tuesday on Black Star Network for A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie. We'll laugh together, cry together, pull ourselves together, and cheer each other on. So join me for new shows each Tuesday on Black Star Network, A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie.
Hatred on the streets, a horrific scene, a white nationalist rally that descended into deadly violence.
White people are losing their damn minds.
As an angry pro-Trump mob storms the U.S. Capitol,
We're about to see the rise of what I call white minority resistance. We have seen white folks in this country who simply cannot tolerate Black folks voting.
I think what we're seeing is the inevitable result of violent denial.
This is part of American history. Every time that people of color have made progress, whether real or symbolic, there has been what Carol Anderson at Emory University calls white rage as a backlash.
This is the rise of the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. America, there's going to be more of this.
This country is getting increasingly racist in its behaviors and its attitudes because of the fear of white people.
The fear that they're taking our jobs, they're taking our resources, they're taking our women. This is white fear.
Welcome back to the Black Table. I'm Greg Carr here at the Black Star Network. We're joined today by Professor Natasha Warikoo, author of Race at the Top, and also really a powerful sociologist, social scientist, intellectual worker, and activist in terms of her own intellectual work. Professor Warikoo, Natasha, as we paused there for a moment, you were about to take us into that next iteration as you coming back from the UK and continue your work. Please go right ahead.
Yeah, so I was so at the Diversity Bargain, it's all about these college students. How are they making sense of college admissions, affirmative action in particular? Meanwhile, right around the time the book was almost done, the Fisher case came to the Supreme Court, and that decision came down. And then Ed Blum, who is the man who has bankrolled both of this case and the case that's in the Supreme Court right now, started looking for Asian American plaintiffs because he thought, well, I was unsuccessful in ending affirmative action with a white plaintiff. Now I'm going to turn to people of color and say, well, there's this idea of the model minority that, if Asian Americans are doing well, then we must have racial equity, right? Which, of course, there's so many reasons why that's a faulty logic. And he claimed he got a group of Asian Americans to agree with his logic and join his group to say that they are experiencing racial discrimination. And I mean, the funny thing is, at the beginning I was like, well, okay, maybe there's anti-Asian discrimination, but then why is the remedy to that ending affirmative action for Black and Latinx kids? Those are two totally separate issues.
Oh, interesting. Help me with it, because that's very interesting. So you were suspicious, of course, I guess, as were we all, Bloom's motives from the beginning. But as a scholar, you approached this a little differently. I think one of the most fascinating things about your work, among so many other things about it, is that you entered that conversation not from the Black and brown side, but from the Asian side. I think that I'm sure you remember a few years ago, around the time that Fisher kind of emerged, there was a long article in the New York Times Magazine that kind of traced some of but reading your book, I'm like, wow, this really reveals the politics of race in this racial binary, the Black-white binary, really about whiteness, really.
Yeah.
But what you do is enter it in a way that robs it of its hiding places.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating to me, but please go right ahead. I mean,
I appreciate that. I really wanted to tell a much more nuanced story about Asian Americans, right?
Yes.
So, I think this sort of conservatives are using Asian Americans to kind of critique, equity for Black and Latinx and Native American people, which is so problematic on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think sometimes liberals are like, well, in order to combat that logic, they say, well, there's no discrimination towards Asian Americans. And, maybe there is, maybe there's not, but that either way, we can support equity for Black and Latinx people because we know that we have very different histories, and that is what creates these different educational outcomes and opportunities, And so I think being able to understand the ways in which Asian Americans sometimes do experience racial discrimination, but, a lot less in education. It's much more in, some of the stereotyping right now around the coronavirus and the racial attacks. In the past, it was, after 9/11, South Asians felt the brunt of this. In schools, Asian American kids are sometimes bullied. But in terms of if you really cared about anti-Asian discrimination, education is a funny place to look because Asian Americans are actually doing quite well in education.
Yeah.
And so, it's clear Blum doesn't really care about any anti-Asian discrimination. What he cares about is ending racial equity, right? He was behind the Shelby versus Holder case where they ended pre-clearance for the Voting Rights Act, which basically allowed all of these states, do what they're doing right now, which is to create all these barriers to voting and not have to get cleared by the federal government to make sure that they're not in violation of the Voting Rights Act. And so he did that, and now he's attacking affirmative action. And so you know, my goal in this book was really to tell a nuanced story about the ways that Asian Americans sometimes benefit from policies that have historically benefited whites. Like, yeah, sorry.
No, not at all, because we're definitely now moving toward race at the top. It's fascinating as you enter this conversation. You know, you very much keep the power dynamic at the front of this narrative. And you're right. I mean, in this settler state we live in, we've been put at each other's throats too often. And so many people, including well-meaning white folk, who you begin your book with, of course, in this town of Woodcrest, but you never allow the politics of hierarchy and power to exit the conversation. In fact, they remain at center stage. So, you know, how do you maintain an advantage for whiteness in a society, even when people playing by the rules master the rules? And as you write, and have you written elsewhere, but also here, this is not a new story. But the way you put it together, I think is very, I mean, of course, it takes us back to Bakke. And as you were talking, I'm thinking about the white flight with Milliken versus Bradley. And the Supreme Court says, no, you can't desegregate Detroit by using all those other districts that ring Detroit. But of course, Bakke, which changes affirmative action from remedying past discrimination to diversity. But at the center of that whole conversation, as you bring Bloom in, you place advantage, you place privilege. And so that race is not to the top. Whiteness, at least elite whiteness, is at the top. And so here come some non-whites who are playing by these rules. And what you begin to tease out and present to us is the fact that playing by the rules isn't enough, because what's really at stake is power and advantage. So could you tell us, you know, in fact, help me if I'm wrong, you actually entered the place you named Woodcrest to, you know, preserve folks' anonymity. You were there to actually visit a friend. Is that how you were going? And this, talk some more about, I mean, you know, how you even come to this project, Race at the Top.
Oh, yeah. So, you know, I was interested in this question of Asian Americans and advantage. And, you know, I think Asian Americans too, you know, I try not to let anyone off the hook in this book when I try to be fair and, you know, like, and generous in my analyses of people, and talk about, you know, the way these kind of policies kind of create these situations. But I also think Asian Americans you know, when they experience this kind of pushback from whites in this town, is very well off town, they don't see the ways that they are also benefiting, you know, that they are in this kind of community that is, you know, over 80% of adults have a college degree, when only 1 in 3 American adults has a college degree, where, you know, median household income is well over $100,000 a year. Like and their kids are benefiting from all of those resources that families are pouring in to the education system. And so, and they're not seeing that, right? They see the ways that whites are sometimes pushing back against them, and, you know, and they're right to say, like, that's not right. So I try to tell like this kind of nuanced story. But to your point, yeah, one of the first, I was sort of thinking about these questions, and then I went to visit a friend who was renting a place in this town, and you know, you sort of, your image of the suburbs is, right, you know, my friend is living in a suburb, it's going to be mostly white, and you know, I go for brunch, and then suddenly we go out into the courtyard, and it was like all of these, it was mostly South Asian and East Asian families, and I was like, what?
Again,
where are we? We're not, this is the suburbs, my stereotype of the suburbs. Yeah.
It's like little India. And just for folks to understand, so this is a real place. You spent 3 years there. You interviewed parents and staffers and children, high school students, but it is a place. And I loved how you wrote about how it changed. Yeah. And as you were writing, I was thinking about my hometown of Nashville and how gentrification, you talked about how these big houses replace these smaller houses, but the thing happens so fast. Could you break down the kind of demographics of this place that you end up centering race at the top at? I mean, and how the ethnic kind of balance changes? Because we know that when we say Asian Americans, you know, that doesn't tell us much. So could you talk a little bit about, you know, how this place came to be that you then centered the study in?
Yeah. So like many suburbs, not all, but like many suburbs in the United States, this was a town that, you know, really expanded in the 1950s, 1960s. And, you know, we have to place it in the context of kind of urban school integration, right? So school, after Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, schools are kind of pushed eventually to integrate, and the white middle class who can afford it, many of them leave the cities and they move to the suburbs. There's a great book by a woman called Lily Geismer called Don't Blame Us. It's called Suburban Liberals, which is all about people who kind of moved to the suburbs, had a liberal identity, really critiqued the whites, as they should have, who were protesting racial integration in the city, but in their own towns. And I think this town is one of these places where they enacted laws like single-family home laws. You could only build single-family homes, minimum housing lot sizes, right? So again, keeping working-class people out. In many places, protesting proposals to bring public transportation to the town. Pushing back against proposals to have an integrated. This is prior to the Supreme Court decision. Proposals to integrate the urban and suburban school districts so that there could be more integration. And so, you could be liberal in the suburbs and say these things, but you were protected from that racial integration in other ways, and which are supposedly race neutral, right? But it was both class and race. And so that's the kind of history of towns like this. And, and then fast forward to, the 1980s, 1990s, in 1965, sorry, let me go back. 1965, the McCarran-Walter Act was basically an immigration act that prioritized highly skilled migration from Asia. So after that, we started seeing these flows of highly skilled, particularly Indian and Chinese. And India and China are the two largest sending companies to the United States, countries to the United States today. So highly skilled immigrants from these countries, this is not like a cross section of people from those countries, right? These are the academic elites.
And that's a critical point. I mean, it's not like the immigrants who were brought here under force, like the ancestors of the Africans, and it's not like the folks who become white in the late 19th to mid 20th century who are here. These folk are recruited precisely because they are I guess it could be like enslaved people in some ways, because people think those people didn't come here with skills. They came because they had skills too. But I mean, that's actually interesting. But I tell you what, let's pause for a second. When we come back, we're going to spend the next block talking exclusively about race at the top. And you brought us right to the doorstep of this transforming Woodcrest that you enter for 3 years and begin to peel back all these layers and subtleties that help us understand how race, class, and privilege work in this country. So we'll be back in a moment. With the next segment of the Black Table. I'm Greg Carr, your host here at the Black Star Network with Professor Natasha Warikoo. Back in a moment.
When we invest in ourselves, we're investing in what's next for all of us. Growing, creating, making moves that move us all forward. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Does it get better than never getting lost? Does it get better than not parallel parking yourself?
Alexa, ask Smart Feed to feed the dog.
Does it get better than feeding your dog from 50 miles away? Yes, it does. At Buick, we see a future that's even better. Because the life-enhancing innovations you've never even dreamed of, Buick is dreaming of them every day.
When you talk about Blackness and what happens in Black culture, we're about covering these things that matter to us, speaking to our issues and concerns.
This is a genuine people-powered movement.
There's a lot of stuff that we're not getting. You get it when you spread the word.
We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. We cannot tell our own story if we can't pay for it. This is about covering us. Invest in Black-owned media. Your dollars matter. We don't have to keep asking them to cover our stuff. So please support us in what we do, folks. We want to hit 2,000 people, $50 this month, raise $100,000. We're behind 100,000, so we want to hit that. Y'all money makes this possible. Check some money orders. Go to P.O. Box 57196, Washington, D.C. 20037-0196. The Cash App is $RM Unfiltered. PayPal is R Martin Unfiltered. Venmo is RM Unfiltered. Zelle is Roland@RolandSMartin.com.
When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Welcome back to the Black Table. Greg Carr, Black Star Network. And we're here discussing with Professor Natasha Warikoo her book, Race at the Top. Natasha, I'm sorry we had to pause there for a moment, but now that we're back, so you were taking us through now, you're right at the verge of telling us how this town changed. And it changed so rapidly. Talk to us more about this, because then you entered the place.
So, post-1965, you have these highly skilled immigrants from Asia. And I think that really ramps up in the last 2 decades. I mean, the Asian American population in this country has nearly doubled in the last 2 decades. So, we think like with the expansion of technology, a lot of high-tech firms. And so you have these immigrants coming from India, China, a little bit from Korea, some from Japan, but really India and China send more immigrants to the United States every year than Mexico separately. And you think about like that massive land border, it's kind of extraordinary that the way that our, and this has been true since for the past over a decade now. So these immigrants are coming and they have highly paying jobs because they are highly skilled, and they can afford to move to places like Woodcrest, to high income, expensive suburbs. And so this town is now the high school is over a third Asian American. It's still a majority white town because very few Black and Latinx kids, almost no Native American kids. And so this town changes ethnically. And, at the same time, I think there's a larger conversation in suburbs like this about pressure, right? About like academic pressure, the kind of competition, when you have this concentration of like very successful parents in the labor market and education, degrees, not just college degrees, but degrees from like elite colleges.
And that was important too. It was really revealing to me. The folks who are coming here went to elite schools at home.
Yes.
And it's interesting because, of course, at Howard, we have a number of students who are from the African diaspora, second gen, kind of like, you are, and their parents went to elite schools and then come here. So, but at the center of this book as well, and I love how you open it with this sister, Sabrina, who's 45 and white liberal, has Black and brown students over at the house. But as you're talking with her and you begin thinking about your own, how you and your husband are raising y'all's family, and this question of how to be a good parent really is a thread that really permeates this book, because it's not the typical good guy, bad guy narrative. Everybody wants what's best for their children. So, I mean, this is what fascinates this Race at the Top. So now all these different kind of people in this space, all who want what's best for their children, and they're drawn on their cultural resources, their backgrounds, but this thing begins to be very much more subtle as you begin to sit and listen with them. Could you talk to us a little bit about, you just want what's best for your children, but how does this play out racially? Because these white parents start talking about athletics, and forgive me again, I was laughing, and the reason I'm laughing was because it was just so revealing. When you said that for some of the Asian parents, they look at like, why are y'all focusing so much on athletics? Athletics is for exercise, not, I'm like, what? All of these subtleties begin to talk to us a little bit about these politics, beginning perhaps with Natasha, who joins the school board, because he said, y'all assigning too much homework. I want my child to do extracurricular activities. Could you talk to us about these kind of subtleties that begin to come out along racial lines, when the common element is we just want what's best for our children?
Yeah, I really tried to sort of, start with this premise, like, we are all trying to do what's best for our kids. That's like, it's like in our blood, right? That's just what we do as parents, right? And so I think, sometimes there are critiques of parents of, it's often parents of color, whether it's Asian parents or Black parents or Latinx parents, of like, doing things the wrong way, but, we're all doing our best, right? And so, but we also do things differently, right? So that's where the idea of cultural repertoire is. I borrow that idea from a sociologist named Ann Swidler, where she talks about how we have this kind of like a toolkit in our head for how to like navigate the world, so, and what to do in certain situations. So we, I think in in this contemporary period in the United States, I think almost every parent wants their child to go to college because we recognize that college matters, right? But there are differences in how much exposure we have to colleges, right? So, and how many people we know who went and got a bachelor's, completed a bachelor's degree and have the cultural know-how to know, okay, you gotta like register for classes, you gotta talk to your professors, you need to, here's how you study for a test. You need to not be working, 50 hours a week if you really want to be able to do well in college. And so all of these things. And I think even in this town of highly educated parents, the Asian parents were mostly immigrants, so had gone to college in Asia, at least their undergraduate degree. And there, the way you get ahead is through academics. It's just academics, right? Yeah. That's all that matters. And it's like a standardized test, right? So that's what they felt. I mean, they got that it's a little different in the US, but that's really what they felt like they knew how to do that, right? Because they were good at it. That's what got them to Woodcrest in the first place. Sure. So they did that. And that's what they had their kids focusing on. Whereas the white parents, they use this word balance a lot, right? They wanted their kids to have balance, that they wanted them to do well academically, but you don't need to take like all honors classes because you also want to do your sports or your theater or what have you. And so like there was much more of an emphasis on that, right? And so that's sort of doing lots of different things.
And to make sure everybody remembers too as well, these white parents you're talking about are already at the top.
Yes.
So this kind of high stakes, and because we all heard the same message growing up, but it's different when you hear it in a damn near $1 million home with all the advantages. And it's different when you hear it coming to a country where the achievement is seen as the gateway and you already have. And it's different when you hear it when you're a black and brown kid who actually hears that and says it, but doesn't have that material advantage. So I thought the metaphor you used of the medals was so important in this. So okay, but please, I didn't mean to, please go right ahead.
Yeah, so there's this, I used to have this line where I say, well, they're like in this race, but they don't realize everybody in town is getting a medal, right? They are all at the top. And the kids who really miss out are the kids who are like well beyond this community, who are, at the urban center, whose parents didn't go to college, who don't have a cousin or an aunt or uncle who went to college, or who don't have a neighbor who finished a bachelor's degree, so don't have those kind of cultural tools. Let alone obviously the financial stuff matters too, but aren't at a school that is providing a high level curriculum and helping them be successful with that high level curriculum. And so I think we don't see when you're in this race, in this town like Woodcrest, you lose sight of that. You lose sight of like all of the advantages you have. And families would say things like, well, Harvard's only going to take a certain number of kids from our school, or Stanford will only accept a certain number of kids from our school. And that's true, but like, compared to like almost every other high school in the country, right, kids in this school actually have a better shot of getting into those schools. Right. And so they don't see that. They're like, well, there's so many high achievers here, it's more competitive. But it's like, and there are so many more resources, so it's like this, it's problematic to have this kind of segregation in this way because people, they just don't see the lived experiences of people outside of their community as much.
Absolutely. Well, Prof, and this is again fascinating until it's in their face. So what happens when this swelling number of non-white students, Asian Americans, Chinese, Indians primarily, as you say, with some Koreans and others as you talk about, what happens when by the rules set in this small kind of ecosystem, they begin to overperform or outperform, and they're coming in at the top all the time? It really struck me in the first chapter where you write about this lady, this white woman, good parent, and her child doesn't get in the advanced math class, and you suspect of the 3 children who didn't, these are also the 3 probably white kids in there who don't go to this Russian math school on nights and weekends, that you're sitting there as an Indian American thinking, should I have my children? They would never. But what happens in that small ecosystem that they can't see beyond when by the rules, the non-white students are now going to take those Harvard spots, going to take those Stanford spots? So how do they react? How do the white parents react?
Well, I don't know that they're taking those spots, right? I mean, they're
Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry.
the white kids are
I
just
sound like
fine.
Ed
Yeah.
Boon. Right.
But they feel anxious, and they feel like, you guys are these families are ruining the curve, and my little Johnny doesn't feel smart anymore. And so, and there is a little bit of pushback. I think the other thing is they feel empowered, right? So they go to the school and say, maybe we should like limit the number of advanced placement courses kids can take. Or when I was there was a big debate about advanced placement. About homework, right? How much homework, and the school, because the community was also very concerned about mental health, and this is even pre-pandemic, right? So I mean, I don't want to minimize. I mean, I think these concerns about mental health are real, and they are so important right now. But I think the narrative was sometimes that, the kind of unspoken narrative, it was never kind of, by most people didn't say this explicitly, but was that, the academics standards are getting higher in part because of the Asian kids. And that is making our kids really stressed out. So we need to reduce the amount of homework teachers are allowed to assign. They eliminated homework in the elementary schools. And, a lot of Asian parents were like, why? A little bit of practice is good. And well, if you're not going to get my kid homework, I'm going to send my kid to Kumon or Russian math or whatever, because they need a little bit of that. And so,
and Prof, it also struck me when you said you only identified one of the Asian parents who said anything about, well, y'all didn't curtail the number of hours they spent on the athletic field.
Yeah.
I mean, and you found that interesting. I thought it was interesting. You read, why didn't they say anything? But it's almost as if they were like, okay, y'all gonna, whatever rules, we're not going to stop doing with our children what we think will get them ahead. Even if you try to curb this on the, hold on, we're coming up on a break, Prof. So I tell you what, let's pause for a minute. Yep. And when we come back, we'll continue with this conversation, and we also want to ask you what you think can be done about this kind of system, and also on what you're working on next. So we're taking our pause, and we will be back with our final segment. Professor Natasha Warikoo, author of Race at the Top, Asian Americans and Whites in Pursuit of the American Dream in Suburban Schools, an award-winning sociologist, well-published author, and really doing some important work to help us understand this issue and how it relates to transforming the society we live in. Back at the Black Table in a moment.
Hatred on the streets, a horrific scene, a white nationalist rally that descended into deadly violence.
White people are losing their damn minds.
As an angry pro-Trump mob storms the U.S. Capitol,
we're about to see the rise of what I call white minority resistance. We have seen white folks in this country who simply cannot tolerate Black folks voting.
I think what we're seeing is the inevitable result of violent denial.
This is part of American history. Every time that people of color have made progress, whether real or symbolic, there has been what Carol Anderson at Emory University calls white rage as a backlash.
This is the rise of the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. America, there's going to be more of this.
There's all the Proud Boys, guys.
This country is getting increasingly racist in its behaviors and its attitudes because of the fear of white people.
The fear that they're taking our jobs, they're taking our resources, they're taking our women. This is white fear.
When we invest in ourselves, we're investing in what's next for all of us. Growing, creating, making moves that move us all forward. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Hit me. Listen to me now. Is you with me now? The biggie bounce. I know you dig the way I switch my style. Holla, holla. Get your freak on. 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 Get your freak on.
When we invest in ourselves, We all shine. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Welcome back to the Black Table. We're entering our final segment with Professor Natasha Warikoo. And this has gone by too quickly. And so I'm going to stop talking. And Natasha, help us with this. Okay, so we've got a system where some of the parents, some of the white parents actually take their children out of the district and go into some private schools. Others run for school board, want to advance policy. Meanwhile, the Asian community, which isn't monolithic, of course, is continuing to try to fight to advance themselves. And you, meanwhile, over the arc of 3 years, are reviewing all of this. I thought it was interesting as you talked to the students as well. I thought about Claude Steele, of course, and so many others writing about stereotype threat. What kind of pressure do these students begin to think about? I mean, what are they going through? And, because I'm sure there's some tension even between the students and the parents.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because so many of the kids were like, yeah, there's a lot of parents pressure their kids. My parents don't pressure me. Like, I heard that from a lot of kids. Like, and it was interesting because I don't think that they were, maybe for some of them it was a defensive, like, I want to protect my parents. But I don't think it was that because I think there was just, it's almost like the pressure when you have this concentration of income and high levels of education, it's kind of in the air. So the school did a school-wide survey that, I was not a part of, but I looked at the data. And one of the things they asked kids was, do you feel pressure to get good grades from your parents? And when you look at those answers by race, the group that reported the highest level of pressure from their parents was the African-American kids. Most of those kids were part of the busing program. So they were kids who were bused in from the urban center.
We need to make that point. Everybody, when you go to read this book, please understand. So when you mentioned at the beginning that there are small, so what you say, like 4%, maybe a little bit more Black and brown, these are not children primarily who have moved to Woodcrest because of their economic, they were brought in.
Yeah. There was definitely some Black and Hispanic families in the town, but most of them in the school were bused, and they were bused from kindergarten. So they've been in the district. So they were not. Most of them had been going to the school district for a while, but it was the Black kids who reported the highest level of parental pressure to do well in school. Now, interestingly, the Asian kids were more likely to report. Compared to whites and Black and Latinx kids, reported the highest level of pressure coming from their peers to do well in school, which is interesting because they were also more likely to be in those high-level classes. So it might be that, well, if you're taking all AP classes, your peers are going to exert a different kind of pressure than if you're just, in the regular college prep classes.
Yeah.
But I think, I think, again, there are these stereotypes about like Black parents, about Asian parents that just don't bear out, or that's not the kids' kind of perception about what's going on.
Yes.
And that's not, that was like a survey. So it wasn't like telling me what they, there wasn't there's not the same worry of like needing to protect their parents or something like that from the stereotype.
So let me ask you kind of as we kind of, because again, folks, you really do need to read Race at the Top. I mean, all of your work, Natasha, but this book in particular, given where we are, particularly with affirmative action and the debate, is there a way to quote unquote fix this? I remember watching a conversation you had with Adam Harris, who like me is a public HBCU graduate, you're Alabama A&M. And you talked about redistributing resources, redistributing endowments, redistributing public tax dollars. And certainly that's one way to perhaps approach it. But I guess I want to ask you a couple of questions. And I know you got a new book coming out, and I hope you'll discuss a little bit. Your new book is Affirmative Action Fair. It's coming out this fall. It's like you really timed this perfectly. But how do we reframe this privilege system? I mean, because, a race to the top, if it's a pyramid, everybody can't get to the top. So can we dismantle it? Can we reframe it? You have some solutions you kind of begin to approach near the end of the book, but talk to us a little bit about how you see us really attacking this system as viewers sit here and think, well, damn, how do we fix this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, ultimately what I really would like to see is a different way of, funding schools. I think the way that we fund schools with local property taxes,
Yes.
given our, our housing, residential segregation, the vestiges of redlining that have, that Asian Americans are able to take advantage of, these class segregated neighborhoods. And if you're like an upper middle class Black family, you probably don't want to move to a Woodcrest because there are so few Black families there, right? And so it's like it perpetuates itself. And so I think we need a different kind of funding model. I think we need a different way of housing. I think we need to change housing policy. We need much more mixed income housing in all communities. And I think at the individual level, I think, for people living in places like Woodcrest, we need like a little more, yes, we all want the best for our children, but, we don't need to exclusively only think about our own children.
Yes.
Sociologists John Diamond and Amanda Lewis in their book, Despite the Best Intentions, they talk about opportunity hoarding, right?
Yes.
We don't need to hoard opportunities at all costs and like ignore all of the other kids. And we need to pay attention to, all of the advantages our kids have. And we need to make them aware and help them understand, like, you're really privileged, like you have all of these things and you need to use that for good. And
actually, that reminds me of the piece that you did, the Ivy address, the Ivy class of 2023, where you're telling them you had this privilege, but I can't resist. I really can't resist this. We have a professor at Howard, Fatima Jackson, who's a biological anthropologist, and she tells our freshmen, I don't know if it's apocryphal, but I can confirm with you because you're a social scientist. She said there are more honor students in India or China than there are students in the United States. We're not competing in just the United States. How do you imagine this kind of internal conflict or competition against a global background? And also the other question I'd ask really is somebody who went to and works at a HBCU. And I work at one which I'm afraid is beginning to try to take the lesson and say, if we can just become a Black version of Harvard or Stanford, and we're beginning to see those students who might be in a Woodcrest showing up at these places thinking, well, this is just be the next step and I'll get my JD from Harvard or I'll get my MD from Yale. How do we dismantle this idea that those are the only routes to success? I mean, how do we deal with equity against this kind of reification of privilege while in a United States that is increasingly having to compete globally with folks who are saying, oh, we just against all of y'all, so we don't even care. I mean, I know it's unfair to ask you all that, but I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this, our higher education system is so unequal. You think about like the sort of range from like the Harvard, I don't know what the per student endowment is. I remember seeing these figures of at a place like Harvard or Princeton is even higher, all the way down to like the community colleges. Like the difference in that education is so dramatic. And other countries are not like this. I mean, our neighbor Canada, like most people go to the university in their state, right? Because there's not that much difference between them. They're all solid. And there's not the same idea that we have to be hierarchical and like we have to separate ourselves and, oh, look, this year our admit rate is 5% and now it's 4%. And, we have this like this urge to just be more and more exclusive. And, we're so status conscious in part because we live in such a hierarchical society. And we, this idea of meritocracy props it up, right? This idea that I got to Harvard because I deserve that, not because, my parents were doctors and I had to like struggle for material resources and, they helped me, they taught me how to study. Like, people who win at this race at the top don't see the ways that it is not a fair game. Like they were going to get a medal, just didn't know, and so I think part of it is that is problematic is how unequal our higher education system is.
Yeah.
And I think these colleges need to do better. I remember when I was leaving Harvard, as a faculty member, I went to the dean. I was like, I've been thinking about this. Now that I'm leaving, I can say it. Like, why doesn't a place like Harvard or any elite school, Tufts, why don't we take like I don't know, 5%, 10% of all these donations we get, and say, okay, if you donate to us, we are giving 10% to, Bunker Hill Community College down the street.
Yes.
Where that they are the engines of social mobility, or the, University of Massachusetts, Boston. Like, those are the places where people are experiencing social mobility in big numbers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, of course, there are students who are coming from working class families at these elite colleges, but they're so few and far between. But the places where a lot of, working class, even lower middle class kids are experiencing access and equity and increased opportunity, we should be propping those places up.
That's right.
A lot more than we do.
What was the response?
He smiled.
and now you went to Tufts. No, I'm just
Not working on it at Tufts.
Okay, very good, excellent. Listen, we're coming to a close, and we want you to come back to discuss this affirmative action fair when it comes out this fall. But I got to ask you this final question, Natasha Warikoo, brilliant scholar and really doing this work. How do you think the Supreme Court case is going to turn out? Or is that a tease for the book? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so, when they, first of all, it was kind of a shocker that they took the case. That was not a good sign. Like, the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld affirmative action over and over and over again, multiple cases. Like, why? Like, it's settled law, They
didn't have a number.
And,
we see with Roe, they just needed the numbers. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, and if it's, if it's the Asian American plaintiffs, this is not the history that we want as Asian Americans to be on the wrong side of history. It really breaks my heart.
Well, to your observation, though, it isn't the Asian American. I mean, you very carefully observe this isn't. This is Ed Bloom, as you said. It's not the Asian Americans. Yeah.
I mean, I was cautiously optimistic, I think, prior to the Roe leak, that, maybe it will be a partial pullback or something. And I don't know, I'm not sure now. I feel a little more pessimistic given, this, I'm not an expert in reproductive rights, but I certainly did not see this one coming. Mm-hmm. And I feel like affirmative action, the fact that they took the case, is worrisome. But I think we have to wait and see. We shouldn't treat it like a done deal. I think some of the conservatives are treating it like a done deal. They're on to, I don't know if you've seen that case at Thomas Jefferson High School where they're attacking race neutral policies that are trying to expand opportunities. So I think they're all right, now we're going for, everything. So
I think that's what makes race at the top so compelling. It's almost as if you've looked beyond any kind of outcome in terms of affirmative action to really begin to address this question of structural inequality. And I really think that's one of the main things that makes this a brilliant work. So I hope, you can make time in your schedule. And folks, I don't know how she works and does as much work as she does, but to have carved out an hour of your schedule is a real honor and blessing for you to come and have this conversation with us. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much for this conversation and for having me. It's an honor on my part.
No, absolutely. We'll have you back. We want you back. So thank you. And when we come back in a moment, after having this conversation with our friend Professor Natasha Warikoo, we are going to clear the table and we'll get ready for next week. Back in a moment here at Black Table.
When we invest in ourselves, we're investing in what's next for all of us. Growing, creating, making moves that move us all forward. Together, we are Black beyond measure.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jackie Hood Martin, and I have a question for you. Ever feel as if your life is teetering and the weight and pressure of the world is consistently on your shoulders? Well, let me tell you, living a balanced life isn't easy. Join me each Tuesday on Black Star Network for A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie. We'll laugh together, cry together, pull ourselves together, and cheer each other on. So join me for new shows each Tuesday on Black Star Network, A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie.
You have
Academy and Allison 10-speed transmission. Features available on GMC Sierra Heavy Duty, premium and capable. That's professional grade from GMC.
When we invest in ourselves, our glow, our vision, our vibe, we all shine. Together, we are black beyond measure.
In a 1960 address to Black social science teachers at Johnson C. Smith University, an HBCU in Charlotte, North Carolina, W.E.B. Du Bois, in a speech called Whither, Now, and Why, said that the desegregation of the United States was inevitable, that the laws were going to change. And when those laws changed, Du Bois cautioned those social scientists and social science teachers that the real questions would then emerge for the Black community in the United States, and that those questions would be questions of race and culture. He said we would have to decide who we were, where we're going, and decide why we had decided where we were going and who we were. Professor Natasha Warikoo has done us a great service in pushing us to think about culture, parenting, structural barriers, and solutions beyond our discrete cultural identities. And particularly for people of African descent listening to her in her discussion today, it really challenged us to think about our cultural resources, how we interact not only with other folk, but with ourselves, and how we achieve a better society for everyone. So we'll be back next week at the Black Table here at the Black Star Network. Please join us.
When we invest in ourselves, we all shine. Together, we are black beyond measure.
Does it get better than never getting lost? Does it get better than not parallel parking yourself?
Alexa, ask Smart Feed to feed the dog.
Does it get better than feeding your dog from 50 miles away? Yes, it does. At Buick, we see a future that's even better. Because the life-enhancing innovations you've never even dreamed of, Buick is dreaming of them every day.
When you talk about blackness and what happens in Black culture, we're about covering these things that matter to us, speaking to our issues and concerns.
This is a genuine people-powered movement.
A lot of stuff that we're not getting. You get it, and you spread the word.
We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. We cannot tell our own story if we can't pay for it. This is about covering us. Invest in Black-owned media. Your dollars matter. We don't have to keep asking them to cover our stuff. So please support us in what we do, folks. We want to hit 2,000 people, $50 this month, raise $100,000. We're behind 100,000, so we want to hit that. Your money makes this possible. Check some money orders. Go to P.O. Box 57196, Washington, D.C. 20037-0196. The Cash App is $RM Unfiltered. PayPal is R Martin Unfiltered. Venmo is RM Unfiltered. Zelle is Roland at RolandSMartin.com.